You're listening to Legal Sounds, practical advice for SMEs, the podcast from Davis Blank Furness.
Hi, welcome to a new business podcast series from Davis Blank Furness, one of Manchester's longest established and friendliest law firms. I'm Andy McNish, a solicitor and partner in Davis Blank Furness. I've 35 years' experience of helping business owners navigate all sorts of legal issues and will be your host for the next 30 minutes. Today we're going to talk about business succession, how best to plan your retirement and exit from your business. In this part of the series, we're not going to be discussing external sales to a trade buyer or venture capital and the like, but concentrate on internal transfers of ownership, whether to co-owners, family members, or to your current staff. Such internal transfers tend to be more under your control, both in terms of structure and timing, than external sales, but they do present their own operational, structural and tax pitfalls, which we're here, hopefully, to enlighten you about. This is not going to be a technical discussion, but very much a practical one, with input from people with years of day-to-day experience in helping business owners plan and implement successfully stepping back from their businesses and enjoying the well-deserved fruits of their hard work. So without further delay, please let me introduce the other members of the panel for this podcast. First, Lauren, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, my name's Lauren Sever. I'm a solicitor and partner at Davis Blank Furness. I'm in the corporate commercial department and I work alongside Andy. I also liaise often with Chris. So Chris, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Chris Barrington from Barrington Hulse Tax and Advisory. We're a tax planning and advisory consultancy and we act throughout the life cycle for businesses and their owners.
Okay, so Chris, from your own experience, what tends to be the main sort of motivations for succession and succession planning?
Well, I think it's in my experience, very often our clients don't necessarily come to us with a predetermined motivation. If you pushed me, I'd say everybody wants a little bit more time after they've been working for 3 or 4 decades and more. But we find that when it comes to succession, there are a whole range of different triggers that give rise to it. Now, just an example, something we've got a number of jobs on at the moment, and one particular trigger which has led to a serious discussion about succession was funding for the grandchildren's education and how that might be achieved. And what we find in succession plans is that there are all sorts of features and aspects which can be solved or attended to in the context of a change in overall ownership. So I would say that motivationally, ultimately, time is very important. The ability to pass down and give initiative to those more junior than yourself, and obviously releasing some capital to enjoy that time.
Do you feel that COVID affected people's desire to retire earlier, or is that just a small wrinkle? It's always an ongoing flood of people coming towards you wanting an exit?
I think that was undoubtedly the case. I think we saw a significant increase in people's appetite for spare time after COVID. So we've had a greater interest in the prospect of passing down, to the next generation, or to the management team in order to enjoy more time and to realise some capital. I think that's been true across all generations in our experience.
Do you feel that people tend to go too early or too late, or about the right time?
When we're talking to clients about succession, and it's very often the case that we raise this in discussions about other things, as I mentioned before, and you have to be just a little bit diplomatic. You have to be careful not to be in that kind of, that Joe Biden situation where you might be suggesting that it's time's up, as it were, before the respondent necessarily agrees. But one thing that we know from our experiences, you can wait too late, or you can wait too long, to enable the next generation to exercise their initiative. There comes a time when, the son or the daughter or whatever starts to lose a little bit of energy and motivation, and it's important that initiative and that energy is accessed and tapped, at the right time. And we see plenty, with loads and loads of circumstances over the years where, possibly dominating senior generation have clung on to power, if you like, for too long. When the next generation has so much more to give. So it's a diplomatic conversation, but when it's open, usually they're listening and they like the opportunities that it provides.
On the flip side of that, do you find that they often sometimes wait too long, hoping that the next generation will have the appetite to take over, and sometimes it's just not there? Do you find that that's quite common? Yeah,
I think that's fair comment, and I think it's probably true to say that every successful business owner is sceptical about the ability of the more junior staff or family to do a good job, aren't they? That if you're talking to a successful business and a successful business person, they know that the next person is not going to be the same. They see the weaknesses. They don't necessarily see the compensating strengths, and they don't necessarily recognise that those individuals are servants to that master and might have had to keep their mouth shut quite a long time, whether they're family or whether they are senior employees. So there is a leap of faith associated with succession, but there's no doubt about it. Owner managers don't necessarily recognise what the next tier is able to do until they see it during, the transitional period of a succession.
Do you find there's tension sometimes between the staff that have been working for years and family members? If you're inserting a family member or pushing a family member to the front, that can presumably lead to disruption in the happiness of the staff who then are working for a new boss who may be junior to them in years. Is that a risk that...
It's a key point, I think, when we are designing our succession plans, and it's something that we really enjoy doing because it has a whole range of stakeholders, as you've just kind of indicated. There's mum and dad in this instance that have set up and run this business for 30 years. There are family members that are within the business and are senior in the business. There are then senior non-family members, senior employees, and there are family members who are outside the business, aside from the general employees and any other stakeholders that might be on the fringes. And establishing a plan of action which has an eye on all of those interested parties, all of those parties who have got views and have got a part to play in the general life surrounding this wealth-generating entity, which is that company, they all need to be factored in ultimately to some kind of solution, even if some of the time that's, there's some tough love in all of that. The company is the wealth generator. There are a lot of people relying on that either directly or indirectly. It needs to be given, tremendous respect, but trying to bring everybody along in a sensible way, which makes it harmonious and hopefully continues to be successful, is a real challenge, and it's part of the overall design structure of this.
When we talk about tension, obviously you've got the consideration to kind of factor in. How do they tend to kind of work out how the consideration is decided upon? Obviously, a lot of the time it's close associates, it's family members. So money can often be a difficult topic. So how do you kind of address that?
All of these engagements where we're designing and implementing succession, they're all very, very bespoke. And I know it's easy to say that, but it's true because at the end of the day, you're in different businesses, different sizes, different personalities. There are all sorts of different factors. And when you're talking about the consideration, the price here, it is true to say that on the one hand, where we have, say, a family business, one of the, if you like, relaxing elements associated with that relative to management buyouts where we're talking about unconnected parties is if we push the boat out, so we're generating a transaction that's going to yield, a higher rather than a lower price, higher rather than lower proceeds, then, that might be in everybody's interests, on the basis that that next generation who are coming into the driving seat in the business are going to enjoy the fruits of some of that extraction of value coming back via inheritance at the end of the day. So in a family scenario, it can be, not necessarily, it depends on the relationships involved, but it can be a freer place, as it were. At the other end of the spectrum, in a controlled succession scenario like this, where we have a team of managers, they will necessarily be interested in the overall affordability of this, and they will be concerned to ensure that they're getting a fair deal and they're not having to wait 10, 15 years before they can see light at the end of the tunnel and something for them and for their families. So it does always depends. But it's true to say, in these controlled succession plan arrangements, we generally have more scope to do what we want as sellers than we might have, for example, in an external sales scenario where you're being, chipped as far as possible by a buyer.
Is the process similar to an external sale, or does it feel very different, do you think?
It feels very different in my experience, and I think we would describe the process as one of design and discussion, and I think I've touched upon that already. So everybody, if you like, is on the same side in this scenario, because we want this to work. We want this to work for the outgoing, even though they may not in actual fact be outgoing shareholders. They may well typically retain a significant stake in the business. And I was only looking before this podcast at the last 6 succession plans that we've been involved in over the last 6 months, and 5 of them have involved significant stakes being retained by the senior generation, which is important. Partly it helps to fund the transaction. Partly it means that those individuals can stay involved. There's an emotional attachment associated with a business that they've maybe built up over decades, etc. There's another payday for them down the line. So it's a very different experience. I mean, I would possibly slightly cynically say that in the trade sale, external sale scenario, we're very heavily focused on a negotiation between 2 third parties who may owe each other nothing, if you like. And there's an awful lot of time spent dealing with warranties and indemnities and protection generally. And we're all trying to score a safer place for our clients with less, I would suggest, less time capable of being spent, maybe less time needing to be spent on the needs and wishes of all those stakeholders we referred to before. So the external sale is massively important. It's a very commonplace means of exit. And of course, that generates typically new funds, as it were. What that gives that the internal sale doesn't typically have is usually more available funds for the purpose. And that's the downside more than anything. But it has a different tone. And it's generally a different experience. And it comes with things like, your external deal comes with things like contingent proceeds, which is always an uncomfortable place when you're dealing with people that you don't know. And we all know, don't we, that some of those contingent proceeds never see the light of day, thanks to sharp practice, if you like, on the part of the buyer, with no disrespect intended there. Whereas in our controlled environment, we can manage that, and we don't need to be subjecting ourselves to that kind of uncertainty.
And from a tax perspective, because obviously that's always a key factor to consider, really, what are the most important tax issues that you've got to kind of consider?
Yes, I mean, we label ourselves as a tax planning and advisory consultancy, and that's our core, if you like. But we're always at pains to make clear that when we're helping business owners throughout that life cycle of business, and indeed throughout their own life cycle, tax is always there, and we're always avoiding the pitfalls and accessing the reliefs, and there's plenty to talk about in all of that. But actually, in terms of the advice and assistance involved, it usually forms a relatively minor part of the overall transaction and what's involved. Nevertheless, it is enormously important. So in answering your question, I suppose, first of all, and certainly within the UK as it stands at the moment in 2024, and as it has been for many, many years, there's usually a very important need to ensure that this transaction gets into the capital gains tax code rather than anywhere else in the tax code, which means that those receiving proceeds suffer lower rates of taxation, lower tax exposures than they would be elsewhere. And that means persuading HMRC some of the time in these, controlled circumstances that we are going through a real transaction with a real surrendering of control. That's very important, on a real commercial basis. And we tick all the boxes as far as the tax code is concerned in order to get into capital and to get into those advantaged rates that we have, whether we consider them generous or otherwise. We've all heard of entrepreneurs relief. That's not the right terminology for it now, but it seems to have stuck. We talk about business asset disposal relief and our 10% rate of capital gain. So that's very important. But in addition to the actual absolute amount of money, the absolute amount of tax that might be payable in relation to a transaction, it's very important that we've got protective elements in there such that if for any reason proceeds don't come through, because maybe the next generation do make a hash of it and we don't get paid typically our significant deferred element of consideration, then we don't end up paying tax on thin air, for want of a better word. But it's not just about the tax on the transaction itself. We also have, and I just referred to it there, we have a deferred consideration tail in all of that, and that's typically significant, and it typically runs for a number of years, whether that's 3 years, 5 years, and longer, etc. And given that more often than not we're dealing with individuals who are at the senior end of the spectrum going into this succession arrangement, then it's important that they are protected from inheritance tax in relation to that value, which might be standing as unredeemed for a considerable period of time. So part of our overall plans typically ensures that the deferred element in all of this is inheritance tax friendly, and it preserves that 100% relief that they had previously when they were holding all the ordinary shares in the trading business, if you like. So that's another very important part of the overall design from a tax planning point of view.
Is there a tension between gifting money down the generations, using this as an opportunity to gift money down the generations, and getting a full extraction of the value of the business? And how does that tend to be sorted out between the family?
It's true in any kind of succession arrangement that it would be foolish to make assumptions about what the objectives are of any of the stakeholders, but certainly of those stakeholders that are relinquishing control and taking a payday of a discretion. And just referring back to a case that I mentioned earlier, which is actually a law practice unusually. It's not commonplace for us to be working on succession in a law practice scenario, and that's possibly because of some of the solicitors' regulatory authorities, the challenges associated with new stakeholders and one thing and another. And in this particular case, we're working to establish a part trust holding for the grandchildren. I might have mentioned that there was a real educational cost requirement within the family associated with the grandchildren. A whole raft of three first generation, mum and dad, 3 second generation, 8 third generation, private school everywhere you look, and coming out of private school straight into university, lots of annual charges and a real need there. So in that scenario, and I think it touches upon what you said there, there's huge merit in this succession having a very different flavour from just tax efficient proceeds out for mum and dad in that instance. Well, actually what they're interested in is helping their kids to fund their grandchildren's education so that all of them have got that chance. And in the north of England, that's £15,000 to £20,000 per grandchild. So there's a big, significant obligation there that they're committed to. And that's only going to be funded if we're doing it tax efficiently out of dividends from the privately owned business. The privately owned business is the perfect income generator in order to facilitate that. So in this particular instance, there's a very significant cascading of that estate, of a chunk of this value into trust as it happens, but effectively down to the grandchildren in order to help them through what might be 10 years each of private education costs with all that goes in that. And it's true across the board. There isn't one size fits all. There isn't one solution. Your point is a good one. It isn't always a case of 10% proceeds and 20% tax proceeds coming out to mum and dad and then they go on cruises for the rest of their life. There's lots of cascading involved depending on who wants to do what.
I suppose in the modern era, it's especially with the house property prices and all the other problems the young have in getting their foot on the ladder, it's passing monies down the generations that become more and more important. Yes,
absolutely. And that at the end of the day, when you start talking to business owners about the merits of succession, which they may not really have taken seriously, and they see that there is a possibility of extracting value. There are a lot of companies out there with a lot of cash on the balance sheet, a lot of surplus cash, which is accumulated as a result of good business practices, but which prudent owners don't necessarily want to extract, maybe inhibited by high rates of income tax or whatever. And when they realise that there are solutions that access that money at tolerable levels of taxation, and actually nothing significant really needs to change, they can continue to do what they love doing. They can continue to oversee great work, win great contracts, and be excited by the buzz of the daily business life, and continue to a large extent to control, in inverted commas, by reason of the courtesy and the respect that everybody holds them in, then the transaction suddenly becomes even more attractive than it ever would have done. And that's why we might have business owners at younger ages seriously contemplating entering into a succession plan, knowing that their life doesn't have to fundamentally change. We're not necessarily talking about retirement. In fact, usually we're not talking about retirement. We're certainly talking about gaining a little bit of extra time, but we are talking about a significant and tax-efficient extraction of value in a lot of cases. And the simple truth in life is that money that you can use now for your kids' education, for repairing the roof, for whatever, is much more valuable than money in 15 years when, the roof's caved in and the child's grown up. So accessing those funds sooner rather than later on its own, aside from any of the other benefits, is a massive positive in my view.
It sounds like you think there are a lot of business owners out there now that are, whether they're just ostrich-like driven forward and not thinking about this, they're missing an opportunity to perhaps make a qualitative difference in their lives and the lives of their children now.
Well, sometimes I think that's true. It's a curiosity sometimes when you work with business owners and they have stacks and stacks of undrawn profits in the bank, and I don't know whether that's a symbol of success. I don't know whether some of these individuals regard that as a badge of honour, and I appreciate that. But a lot of the time, it's not really doing anything. It's not working for the family or for anybody else. It doesn't just have to be the family. So an opportunity to access it. I totally understand the inhibition of high rates of income tax, and certain parts in your schedule of income that can go through the roof. That can go up to 60% and more. So that's a very high slice away of income tax, which nobody's going to enjoy. So if you can give them an alternative and we can start to make that work, then things can start to happen.
I know we've sort of touched a lot about the business owners themselves, but from the sort of the successor's perspective, what kind of factors should they be considering following the actual sale or transfer itself?
Well, I guess the successors have got an awful lot to think about, because all of a sudden they're in charge in theory. I mean, they may not be fully in charge for a period of time. It's commonplace, for example, for the so-called outgoing shareholder, who may or may not be outgoing in practice at all, but it's commonplace for them to have some protections ongoing while they're waiting for their money, if you like. So it would be normal for them to have rights of veto over things that the successors might choose to do in the absence of those rights of veto. But so all of a sudden, they are nevertheless, despite those rights of veto, in the driving seat, at least in theory. Maybe during a transitional period of time, there'll be still lots of deference, obviously, to the outgoing. They will, more often than not, they will be very much focused on affordability in everything. They've got to run a business. It's got to continue to pay its way. And it's got an additional burden to service, which is the outgoings deferred consideration. And inevitably, we like to get that paid off sooner rather than later, because later is more risk and sooner is less risk. So it's in everybody's interest usually to get that paid off quickly, but that's an additional focus on their mind. So it's very important in the design that all that affordability, as far as you can gaze into the crystal ball, is accounted for, and that hopefully that there's something in it for the incoming team, so that they're not having to wait too long before they start to enjoy the fruits of their labours or whatever. So it's an important balancing act. There are all sorts of things that they potentially might have to consider. One thing that we like to talk to the incoming about early on is that it's typically a great time immediately in the aftermath of a succession plan to think about the introduction or the incentivisation of the next potential team that will take over, a younger team that's coming through the ranks that they want to retain and hold, and maybe be the subject of a buyout in 5 years or 7 years or 10 years. So, and you just might have to trust me on this one, but a business that maybe sells for a price of £5 million on day one, on a management buyout or a family succession, typically is a business that's owned by a new buying vehicle in this structure that owes £5 million, if you like, and the compendium of that is a group that arguably has a value of zero. And it's a value of zero, which of course is going to bounce upwards as soon as all of that debt is repaid. That's a golden opportunity faced by the tax code to bring new talent in without hitting the pitfalls of employment-related securities for these individuals, and get them into place with their small stakeholdings, things that differentiate this employer from somewhere else where they might like to go down the road, lock them in and give them the opportunity to be part of a buying out team for the next phase.
And I know throughout this podcast you've sort of mentioned that you normally do a scheme, a plan or something. So how does that kind of look? Is it like a formal document you draw up for the people that have asked you to do it? How do you kind of interact with your clients?
Well, yes. We have a sort of we call it a 3-stage approach. It's probably a 4-stage approach. we start with actually the official outline. Sorry, the official line is that we start with what's called an outline paper, which harnesses all the background information, plots all the objectives, identifies where we think we're going in broad terms, and that's just a capture platform, if you like, to make sure that everybody is on the same page, that we've captured all the relevant information, that we haven't missed some key aspects or got the wrong end of the sticks. And it's surprising how easy it is to either miss something or get the wrong end of the stick, first of all. We then move into the guts of of the scheme, which is, we call it our design and feasibility. So we do a report that's typically 40 pages long, and that is our design of what we are going to do, tackling the implications, commercial, tax, accounting, financing, legal, to the extent that we can envisage that, and we have input from people like yourselves. And we plot that design and we highlight the merits of it as we see it relative to the objectives. We plot the downsides and the risks, and there are some of those, some of the time, which need to be discussed, ironed out, lived with some time, and we establish information that's going to be relevant to third-party professionals in this process, including people like yourselves as corporate lawyers, including the incumbent accountant that will need to account for all of this. And we plot the technicals, so if anybody's got the desire to read and understand where these outcomes come from, it's there for them. And that, of course, protects us in the process. Typically, when we've been through our design and feasibility process, and we discuss that, and the client decides, yes, they like what we're doing, they like the upsides, they can live with the costs and any risks that might be involved, then typically the sort of, well, I suppose the stage 2B in all of that is that we go to HMRC most of the time with an application for clearance, because usually in these kind of schemes there's some form of application to HMRC for approval and blessing. That goes in. Hopefully we get our approval, as we do 99% of the time, I'm pleased to say, and we move on to implementation, which is where we come and speak to people like yourselves in order to make all of this happen, of course.
Thank you very much. We hope that you've enjoyed this podcast and learned something from it. Please keep your eye out for the next episodes in the series. Thank you very much. And from Davis Blank Furness, goodbye.